Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this week for the student-run Study Tips for the New Year and Beyond conference here at Lunch School. So we have a few ground rules to knock out before diving into our presentation today. First off, we'd like to record this presentation. So if there's any reason you are concerned about being a participant in a recorded webinar, please send Liz a message right now before we really get underway. Second, this conference is fully volunteer-based by students of Launch School. So we are going to be following Launch School's code of conduct. Overall, big points here: be kind and be open-minded. We had a ton of RSVPs, so we will be using the Q&A feature to manage all of our questions today. So if you do have a question, please post it in the Q&A area and not in the messages area. You can also upvote questions that are already in the Q&A area to give them a higher priority. If you need an opportunity to speak, you can click the raise hand feature as well. And I think Leena's presentation today is going to be making use of a lot of group discussions, so this will probably come up, so make sure you're familiar with that. Also, you can use the messages feature for commentary, but we will toggle the feature off if it is abused, which hopefully we don't have to worry about that. And lastly, just one plug here, we have a full week of sessions. So I'm going to make a quick reminder about all of the upcoming sessions. Tomorrow, Tuesday at 2 p.m. EST, we have Use What You Know, a journey into metacognition with Mandy. On Wednesday, January 6th at 5 p.m., we have Principles of a 360 Study Wellness Plan with Yulu. On Thursday, January 7th at 3 p.m., 3 p.m. GMT, +1, or 10 a.m. EST, we have Journey to Mastery in Programming Fundamentals, Principles and Practices with Jesse. Then we have a lightning talk on 3 p.m. on Friday. It's called Dangerous Intuitions, 3 Common Intuitions That Make Learning Harder and What You Should Do Instead. And with Jose, and also a study reflection stand-up with Liz. And then 2 more, we have How to Practice Problem Solving Alone and with Others with Callie. That's going to be Sunday, January 10th, 2 p.m. EST. And then Building Tacit Knowledge with Julius, Saturday, January 9th, 2 p.m. EST. So that's all. Without any further ado, I'm excited to get things kicked off with Leena's presentation today on Bloom's taxonomy and how it can help you to be more attuned with your retention of knowledge. And Leena, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Hey, thanks, Kyle. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So like Kyle said, we are looking at Bloom's taxonomy today. This is our agenda. So keep all questions, concerns, ideas you have, even things you're struggling with for the open discussion at the end. We will have a lot of time to go over them. So first off, I'll start off with just like context-wise, so you know like who I am, what is this about, does this bring you value? If not, you're always welcome to leave at any time, but I think you might learn a thing or two today. Then we'll dive deeply into Bloom's taxonomy. So do not be concerned, although it sounds pretty scientific and heavy, these slides will be given to you at the end of the presentation today. So you'll have it as a reference, and there'll also be additional resources you can explore if you want to go deeper into it. Then, of course, we have to have some code. So we're going to walk through a bunch of examples to drill in Bloom's taxonomy and how you can use it. Following that, I'll share some experience with how to implement it specifically for Launch School, then my custom setup, and then again, additional resources, which will be part of the handout, and we'll move on to open discussion. Okay, so first off, what is mastery? Well, some of you may have read the intro prep book, Mastery by George Leonard. And according to him, it's a process, it's a journey. And someone who wishes to become a master is basically someone who stays on a path day in and day out, year after year. Someone who's willing to try, fail, try again as long as they live. For context, I am currently in the object-oriented object-oriented JavaScript course in the Ruby track. I'm from Montreal. This was actually my first time doing something technical. So previously I had studied and worked in social work and nutrition, but this was really my first time to really implement mastery-based learning, especially coming from a non-technical background. So with that, mastery-based learning, when I started Launchcool, I thought it was more about tools. So I tried mem.dev for flashcards, Anki, Mochi, even paper ones. I thought that Google Drive Notes was good. Spreadsheets were great for tracking daily progress. I had seen a lot of people recommend time tracking. So I did that, and I did Pomodoro sessions as well. And I had a paper agenda last year, which I use a lot for checklists. I thought tools were important, so I looked at Notion, Obsidian, Typora, basically any markdown editor I could look at, even paper notes, digital notes, and I even tried for a little while, no notes at all. But in terms of mastery-based learning, all these tools just left me feeling distracted, unsatisfied. But for some reason, again, coming from a non-technical background, I felt like something was missing. I just couldn't get this nagging feeling away, even as I progressed through the curriculum. So wanting to get the most out of my time here at Launchcool and not just pass the assessments, I decided to look deeper into this. So one day through researching, I landed on Bloom's taxonomy. The name was intriguing, so I looked at it, and I've been essentially practicing Bloom's taxonomy in my own customized version since sometimes last summer. I don't exactly know when I found it, but I do know that when I did, it changed my approach to mastery-based learning. So with that, my setup has actually become super minimal because of it. So now I just use Notion for temporary references and reminders on what I need to work on. I use Mochi for flashcards because it supports Markdown and it's only on my desktop, which provides a good boundary when I'm done studying for the day. And sometimes I use paper flashcards if I need like additional reminders, but that's it. And the simplicity is what I want you guys to maybe pay attention to throughout this presentation. Learning really is what's important. The tools you use, they're just there to help you, if they're helpful. You don't have to have all the flashy latest tools. What matters really is what you're able to do, what you're able to retain. And Bloom's taxonomy is a learning framework. It's one of many, not necessarily the best, not necessarily the best for you, but something you have to make sure about is to understand how you learn something to mastery over listening to anyone's advice, including my own today. So with that, let's start looking at what is a framework. So a learning framework, basically, it's a classification that's meant to help learners and teachers. So you can think of it as something that tells you, okay, this is what a learner is supposed to do, and these are key learning objectives that they're supposed to attain. So you can see the framework as a cookie cutter, to which Launchcool is the cookie dough. If you have a good learning framework, you'll be able to cut through the dough with ease and then make nice, delicious cookies. Bloom's taxonomy was actually created in the 1940s by this educational psychologist, Benjamin Bloom, and his associates. So yes, it started in the 1940s. It's pretty old, but they actually took 16 years of annual revision to produce the first version. So that's a commitment to understanding learning, to understanding mastery that I thought was pretty interesting. The classification, again, of Bloom's taxonomy was initially intended to help teachers in assessing their student progress. So it was more designed for the teacher, the one leading, of course, not necessarily thinking about the student. Of course, the student would be the product of it, but the initial intention was to assist teachers in assessing progress. In 2001, so 20 years ago, a student of his modernized the framework, and this is what we will be focusing on today. The rest of the slides, when we talk about framework, will be the 2001 revision. And at the end of the presentation, again, these slides will be handed out with references that give more detail on the original taxonomy for the ones that are more curious. Okay, so back to the prep course. Some of you may have read the book Mastery that's suggested. So George Leonard in the book says, how do you best move towards mastery? To put it simply, you practice diligently, but you practice primarily for the sake of the practice itself. So we know that launch goal has a standard of mastery before being able to progress to the next course. Even at the prep course, you have to send in an email to confirm that you're ready before being able to start paying for the core curriculum. So again, launch goal has a standard, a clear enforcement of mastery. And what today's presentation can do is help you understand how you best learn something to mastery. But before we get to that, this word diligently, I did not exactly know what it meant. So here, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's, as you can see on the screen, something that doesn't sound fun, it doesn't sound easy, but it sounds effective, right? Oops. You are basically putting all your energy, all your effort towards making progress. And Bloom's taxonomy, if applied correctly within your own circumstances, can definitely help you be more effective. So with this context out of the way, let's start looking at Bloom's taxonomy. These are the 6 levels of the taxonomy. So it has actually 2 main parts, the levels, and then what I'll show next, which will be cognition. This part, the first part, classifies the journey a student takes from basic remembering to the never-ending goal of creating. So remember is the foundation that supports all the other levels. So remember, support, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Remember as the foundation, create as the never-ending goal. Okay, so maybe you're wondering, how do you organize knowledge? And how do you know if it's good enough? It's normal if at this stage, everything still feels super abstract, even confusing. We're gonna walk through the taxonomy in detail to make it a bit more concrete. And again, any questions or concerns you have, write them down. We'll have time at the end to talk. On the next 2 slides, we will actually look at the classification of knowledge to answer these 2 questions. And then afterwards, we'll go for the levels that you just saw over here. Okay, so let's start with talking about knowledge. They actually added this categorization of knowledge in the 2001 revision of Bloom's taxonomy. So it's newer, still 20 years old, but it's still something that can add value. So first knowledge that they talk about is factual knowledge. This is basically what you need to know. It's just like jargon. It's just the minimum that you need to be able to function. So for example, if you want to know about closures, you have to know about variable scoping rules. There's just no way around it. If you want to use a method or function like map, or even use a loop, you should have an idea of what iteration is. Factual knowledge is just stuff that is, there's no way around it. There's nothing really to discuss. It's just the way it is. And when I say here first knowledge or first level of knowledge, it's just in this presentation, the sequence, there's actually no hierarchy to knowledge. It's different types of knowledge, but just knowledge that they categorize into specific distinct containers. So factual is the first one we see. The next one is conceptual. Conceptual has more to do where something fits in a bigger picture. So you could think of it as language agnostic. So the domain of programming or software engineering. Whether you're in the JavaScript track or the Ruby track, the concept of scope seeks to solve the same problem, right? Accessibility of variables. So conceptual relies on factual knowledge, and then it provides it more meaning. We have 2 examples here. So again, scoping rules, but also operators, which are both present in JavaScript and Ruby. And their only purpose is to provide a consistent return value. There's no side effects. But in order to understand that, you also have to understand where does it fit in the larger picture. Okay, so next we have procedural knowledge, or more simply, just how to get stuff done. As you know, you can probably solve the same problem 20 different ways. If you look at the exercises and you see user submissions, there's 20, 40, 100 different ways to solve the same problem. And this procedural knowledge can just be seen as knowing how to get something accomplished within your own specific conditions. So 2 examples again, solve the same problem 12 or 20 different ways, design conditionals to account for all the faulty values in the language. Procedural knowledge, doing something. And the last one, metacognitive knowledge is where you come in as a human professional. So you could view this as evaluating trade-offs in a situation. Like, should you use each or filter? And filter is just JavaScript's way of select in Ruby. You could ask yourself if the return value of something matters in the overall program you're designing. It has to do with what you know, contextually what is happening, and also being aware if you have any gaps. So 2 levels, again, in terms of context, when you turn professional, where does something fit in within your business requirements, but also yourself, self-awareness of what's going on, self-assessment in knowing what you do not know or what you do know. So those are the 4 types of knowledge. Let's just recap before we move forward. So again, factual. What is a string? Basic stuff. Conceptual. Related to this field, what problem does something solve? It's a bit more abstract, not implementation specific, but still important to be aware to separate the 2. Next, procedural. Solving something, doing something, implementing something. And metacognitive. Think about maybe what's better, what's worse in your situation, knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know. Okay, so this was the cognitive domains of the revision of Bloom's taxonomy. Next, let's map them together. So here, this is the map that we are using to move forward with Bloom's taxonomy. There's a lot of theory around it. You're welcome to look it up, but for our sakes today, this will be good enough. So we have essentially a process, the levels. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, yeah, here we go. We have the levels that get us to different categories of knowledge. So this, in a few moments, we'll start mapping through them. But before we do, I want you guys to ask yourself maybe, how do you know when you've achieved mastery for your current course? A little backstory. When I first started, again, I don't have a technical background, so I had no idea. I just knew that launch school had this enforcement of mastery before going over to the next course. So in order to prepare for assessments, I would just brute force it. I'd go for the course so many times, I would just stop keeping track of it. I would ensure that I could understand everything and explain it to somebody else, which isn't a bad thing, but maybe not the most effective way. I would also practice with others until I was so exhausted from the stress that the assessment looked like fun and peaceful. So basically, I had no idea how to evaluate my progress. And yes, Launch School gives you a bunch of exercises, a bunch of quizzes, but I personally did not know if I felt good enough, especially with the first 2 assessments. It was still vague, new. I didn't know exactly what to expect. And what I'll show you next is how I've come to determine if I've achieved mastery. And I'm, again, inviting you guys to think about, how do you know when you've achieved mastery? What does that look like? Okay, so this is my subjective use of Bloom's taxonomy applied to Launch School. These are my end goals, so to speak. You'll probably notice right away that I'm not using any of the cognitive domain names that I previously showed you. Those names within the taxonomy aren't meaningful to me, so I changed them to adapt it to my learning experience. What I care about is making progress, and this is how I've come to fit it in my personal mental model. So first, I gotta have a clear purpose of what a concept's role is. What exactly is it? I struggled for a long time understanding object-oriented programming because dogs and cats, as cute as they are, didn't feel intuitive to me. I would like to have a dog later on, but for the sake of Launch School, humans and bodies and anatomy made a lot more sense to me. So when I started mapping what was being said within the object-oriented course to human bodies, this is when it clicked. So abstracting to a mental model is one of my end goals. The next point is organizing a unit's key points. So a unit is anything that can be broken down to the most simplest of forms. So I try to organize its key attributes, facts, design considerations, and procedures here. At this level, I look only basically at the concept and then the implementation. So we learn Ruby and JavaScript at launch school, or one or the other, right? We're actually doing two things. We're learning software engineering, and then we're learning the language implementation. Separating the two is a way that I can test that I've properly understood something. So here, for example, let's say again, we talk about closures. There's the concept of closure, and then there are the key elements that build it up. Being able to distinguish all of those is helpful for me to know that I've achieved mastery. And the study guide actually does a good job of reminding you which topics are important. And this is, again, just my way of organizing knowledge to test my mastery. Next, I look at relationship mapping as a crucial element to my understanding. Very few things exist in isolation. And if they do, usually it won't be very rich or educative. But if I'm able to make connections between what I've learned in one course with other elements of the course, or even with a previous course, that's when I know that I'm solidifying my understanding. So with that too comes precision. Communicating with technical precision is something that launch school pays attention to. In the written assessments and the live assessments, you are asked to speak with as much technical precision to avoid vagueness. And this is one of the pillars I use in order to test if I've achieved mastery. So we've basically looked at different cognitions. You've seen how I organize the knowledge. Let's start looking at the levels now. So that was the pyramid we saw earlier. So level 1 is remember. And here we have a nice little reminder of all the levels. The level is remember. And in my words, I would say it as to bring something to mind or think of at a later time. For each level, you'll also see verbs. This was part of the revision of the taxonomy. These verbs are essentially what a student or a learner is or should be able to demonstrate to accomplish. So, for example, if you're able to remember with accuracy what a string is, great, you may know what a string is. If you're able to recall it a week from now, you can say you've passed this level. It's really just, again, facts. Can I see it, recognize it, and remember it? Nothing too complicated. Level 2 is understanding. So again, some key verbs here, which are actions a student can take towards the level. So here, understanding. And again, you will get these slides as a handout with more resources. So don't bother trying to let this information overwhelm you. Just experience it, just listen to it. And some examples of understanding could be describe rules, explain why or how. And then more contextually, you will start understanding how things behave and the meaning they bring to a domain. Level 3 is apply. Now you start doing. This is actually pretty simple. You just do. So solve a problem, find a different solution, focus on completing bonus features of assignment, remix your solution, and ensure you can apply everything from the previous levels to really integrate this level. Level 4 is analyze. So assuming you've passed the previous 3 levels, you should be able to start to differentiate and organize attributes of parts that are perhaps more complex. Some examples of this include explaining the differences between two similar or different concepts. Some of them also will just be for you to describe concretely what is happening. So in this level, you should be able to see the gray areas and then pick out the elements that are important. So nothing is black or white as in the remember level. A string is a string, cool, nothing more to it. Here, you go a bit deeper and you start thinking. The next level is evaluate. So this, you could say, you start to provide your own opinion based on a criteria. You could discuss the consequences of certain decisions, or you could identify, again, the main characteristics of a concept and its implementation. And then the last level, according to Bloom's taxonomy, is to create. So this is super simple. You just create something, you turn professional. Launch schools 175 and 185 are great for this. Of course, you could always take everything you've seen and create something new, do your own project. could also help others with their questions and their context. There's no limit to this. And within the next few slides, we're going to look at a few more concrete levels and examples to really drill this in. And as we do, I would invite you to keep in mind the cognition domains we saw earlier and see how they can touch upon them. Okay, so firstly, we've got remember. So again, basic stuff. Remember characteristics, be able to identify them. Nothing too complex, but again, essential to move forward. At Launch School, this could be seen as a prep course and the 101 course. It's basically the foundations that support everything else. Next, we've got understand. This is where you start to add meaning within a context that is slightly larger. So here we're testing for truthiness and seeing how a language deals with falsy values. In order to understand this, you need to understand the elements that make it up and then also understand a bit more these complex concepts. For apply, it's just going to be problem solving, doing assessments, taking instructions, applying what you've learned. You may not need to think too much, but you still need to rely on your understanding and the wording, especially. For analyze, you start to compare and contrast. Everything has a purpose. Everything gets a little bit more gray here. It's maybe not as simple as it looks, but there is a lot of overlap with the previous levels, and this requires you, again, to take your time to dissect, to go below just the surface of what's written and really look at what's happening below the hood. Next is evaluate. So this is when you should be good enough to know what's good, what's bad, what has potential. And it's also a great way to start testing yourself, finding gaps. You can pair with others to also provide each other feedback. This is actually an excellent way to know if you're able to understand someone else, develop your technical communication skills, and integrate everything you've seen so far. And the last example is just to create. So this is where you take everything you've acquired and you make something real. All the theory you've learned, all the practices you've done at Launch School, it's just a training ground. What matters is what you can produce in real life to add value or to add joy. Okay, so those were the levels. In the next few slides, we'll talk about adapting it for Launch School. So first off, you have to understand how you master a thing. Launch School's content is great, it's quality, but it is your responsibility to make the most of it. Understanding what your strengths are and maximizing them will just make this whole journey easier. Personally, I don't like to write. I've tried, maybe not hard enough, but I know that it's not an effective use of my time when I'm trying to learning. If you hate talking to others, don't. If you like writing, do it. But the important thing is to take responsibility for your progress. One trap I see a lot is that there's a lot of people giving advice, but you always have to keep in mind what is their context, what are their strengths. Only you can really know yourself. So take responsibility for your progress. The next part is to isolate areas to focus on and make progress within that specific area. Again, there's a lot of content, and if you work strategically towards one of your end goals at a time, it may simplify making progress for you. Again, you have to be aware of what works for you, so reflect on it. Especially if this is your first time programming, it helps to break down the implementation from the concept. Break down the complexity until you reach simplicity in all of its smallest units. Use the verbs that you saw earlier as checklists. And again, the verbs are suggestions. There are so many more verbs available out there, and the resources, they'll link you to a whole bunch. Pick the ones that make sense to you. Bloom's taxonomy is rich in terms of what a learner can and should be able to do, but not all of it matters. Find what works for you and then just ignore the rest. And talking about ignoring, I would say ignore the levels and focus on making progress. In my experience, learning hasn't been linear, as the taxonomy may suggest, so I would suggest you ignore it and just focus on what matters, which is progress, which is your learning. Next step is basically struggle effectively. If things start to get easier, it's time to move on to the next thing. Two things to to work on basically our hard things and then work on other things in order to forget stuff. So what this means basically is make sure you're using your time struggling, learning, putting in effort, being active, and also allow yourself the chance to forget in order to come back and remember. And then just two more things, how I've adapted Bloom to Launch School, and then two, the specific implementation ideas that can touch on multiple levels of cognitive domains, and then we'll get to open discussion. So this is how I've adapted Bloom to Launch School. 6 levels sounded like way too much work, so I just separated it into 3 phases. So my first goal is always just to understand. Those can be the remember and understand levels of Bloom's. And my learning is actually pretty chaotic, messy, it can seem disorganized, but the thing I can guarantee you is that it makes progress. Once I understand, I just move over to practice, which is everything up to evaluate. It's nothing, again, linear. It's just these levels help me identify what I can focus on and how to make progress. And then creating is ongoing. So if Bloom has taught me one thing, it's to customize everything for my own unique circumstances and incrementally optimize them. Foundations first, and then optimize via experimentation. And if there's one thing I hope you get out of this is that learning isn't linear. You have to adapt it to your own circumstances. Take what's good and then just leave out all the rest. And just one last thing, again, before we get to the discussion, specific implementation ideas. So my intention here is to give you ideas that can expand your learning while maximizing also your time at Launch School and use its resources. This isn't exhaustive, it's just a starting point. And I'd love to hear what has worked for you. So do share during the open discussion. Okay, so strategy number 1, this is strangely effective. Talking about concepts to someone on the other track, especially if you do not know how their language works. Katerina and I actually did this, and it helped me a bunch to solidify my understanding of Ruby and programming concepts. 2, reading other people's solutions to exercises, understanding how they see things, their perspectives, and also learning something new along the way. Because there's, again, a million ways to solve the same problem. You can accelerate your learning by learning from others. And same thing with code reviews and their source code. Reading the review, reading their source code just maximizes your learning opportunities within this environment that is Launch School. Okay, so next is the spot, which is great for connecting you with strangers and peers that share a common goal. You could lead them, just message Janae and Austin, and they'll hook you up, or you can just participate. This has actually been instrumental in accelerating my understanding and finding all my gaps. Also, even say you finish a course, there's nothing that would stop you from going back months later, once you've maybe forgotten a few things, and lead a course or even just participate. Students that are going for a course ask the best questions, and just because an assessment says you've aced a course doesn't mean that you're done with it. You can always come back, practice your technical precision while talking before you actually get to the job interview. And next, separating what a concept does from its implementation. This was key for me, especially coming from a non-technical background. Understanding what's happening and how it's done is so important, because when you really understand what the language is doing and how it's doing it, then you just unlock so much more knowledge. And finally, if something's missing, just create it. Like this week of events, Liz had this great idea. Many of us resonated with it. You guys that are watching, you guys that are participating, all the presenters, there's so much implicit knowledge within the Launch Code community. And I cannot talk to everyone all the time, but coming together and creating something larger to serve everyone else helps to just accelerate our own learning and everyone else's. So again, take responsibility, create something if you find it's missing for your mastery-based learning journey. And that is it. Thank you for listening. And let's move on to the open discussion. Kyle, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Leena. So yeah, at this point, we're going to open up the seminar to open discussions. So if you have any questions or any comments that you'd like to make, now is the time. You can go ahead and submit them via the question and answer field if you have a specific question, or if you'd like to respond to someone else's thoughts or comments, go ahead and raise your hand. So yeah, if you have any ideas at this point, go ahead and let us know. Now is an open time for that.
We just got one question. So from Yulu, do you use checklists to keep your learning process focused, Leena?
More or less, that's a good question. I just use the levels and the verbs as a checkpoint, basically. Not a checklist. I'm not trying to check off everything, but I use it to self-assess myself on a regular basis.
Great, thank you for the question, Yulu. If anyone else, oh, I have Bilal would like to speak, so I'm gonna let you talk now. Bilal, you should be able to unmute now. If you can type in the chat if it's having any issue, let me know. Oh, okay, I'll turn that off. All right, I think that is it on the, oh, here we have one from Austin. So Leena, with your goals, abstracting concepts, understanding key points, mapping relationships and precision, how do these play out with your two-phase practice of 1, understanding and 2, practice?
Very perceptive question, Austin. Thank you. Basically, and tell me if I don't answer this correctly, but basically, understanding is just where I try to find as many gaps as possible. And I work towards building up those end goals. So if let's say I'm working on a course, I'm going to try to find each of those different elements and then map them towards those end goals. It doesn't have to be necessarily linear, but I just have to know this is where I'm aiming to be at the end. So those end goals I mapped out, which could be the cognitive domains. And then those 2 levels, so understanding, then practicing, which is basically levels 1 to 5 in Bloom's taxonomy. They're just ways, different pathways I can take to make progress towards those end goals. Does that make sense?
Oh, Austin, you should be able to talk now.
Hi, am I being heard?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Leena. I was just gonna say, like, I guess I was trying to get at, I really liked those points, those goals, and I was just wondering, like, how you make sure that you're staying on track to meet those goals on your day-to-day process of learning.
Okay, yeah. So it's not super like clear. I just use it to make progress, and essentially once I've achieved those end goals, that's basically how I know I'm done. Once things get easy, once I'm able to communicate, identify things, that's when I know I'm done. Otherwise, I just use the different like understand, practice phases as a way to move forward. So I don't like stagnate doing the same things over and over, try to find my gaps as effectively as possible. So it's just different pathways.
Perfect. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you.
All right, and we have a question. Oh, we had a lot of questions come in. I'm gonna hit the one in the chat. Do you have a link you could share on how you take notes in Notion, or could you describe how you take notes? And the underlying question is, Arun is wondering how you take this taxonomy and translate it to documentation.
Yeah, of course. So here, my notes are messy and sometimes I just delete them, but essentially it's just a way for me to make progress towards something. So those end goals I had listed are what I try to organize my notes around. So they're just references and they're not necessarily the end goal, because the end goal is just to be able to remember what I need. But I try to create like a mental model of something, write it down. This is just like an imagery. Then a unit's key points. So like facts about something, let's say strings are mutable in Ruby, they're immutable in JavaScript. So that's a fact, I write it down. Design considerations might be more the style guide that Launchco will recommend, or considerations to keep in mind. Let's say with add a reader, writer, and accessor in Ruby's object-oriented programming course. So there's always considerations around those. Attributes might be, what is it? What is its purpose? And then relationship maps, it's just like, let's say pass by value, pass by reference, they relate a lot to return values, immutability as well in Ruby. So I try to list that out and create a map of what's going on. And then precision is just talking with example. So kind of like how the study guides will have, this is how you answer a question with precision. I'll try to create examples that use precise terminology and describe like generic code or even edge cases. So I don't actually have a link to this because my notes are very messy, and I also like periodically delete them because I stopped looking at them, and it allows me to forget and like practice remembering. But this is essentially how I organize my notes.
Great, thank you. And so let's move on to the next question from Charles. He said, wonderful presentation, thank you. I know there are many note-taking and flashcard tools, and any one tool is not a magic bullet, but could you say a little more about the simple tools you ended up using and how you use them within this process?
Yeah, that's a good, yeah.
I think we had another similar, and Katerina has kind of a similar question and wants to know from the angle of which one you find to be the most useful to map your progress.
Yeah, good question. So I just use something very simple and user-friendly, which is called Notion. And I organize my notes with what's on screen right now. So this is just how I would categorize things. And then for flashcards, I use Mochi, which is desktop mainly. You can pay for the web version. I don't, because I don't want to have my flashcards available to me all the time. And it supports Markdown. So tools, again, I think the main thing is just figure out what's simple and fits into your user, like your own like framework, your workflow, what's simple for your life conditions. Like if you want to have access to your flashcards at all the time, in order to be able to do them while you're waiting in line to do groceries, maybe Anki's better. It just depends on like, what are your conditions? How do you prefer to learn? If you like reading notes at night, maybe, you know, something like a Kindle for your note reading without damaging your eyes too much could be good. So to answer your questions indirectly, think about your life, think about the boundaries you want to enforce between studying and just like living, and then just make it work for that. This is my version, but the point maybe that you should think about is like, what fits into your life? How do you learn effectively? What's better for your progress?
Great, thank you. And we have two more questions from Mandy. Oh, we have some more coming in actually. What were some of the most surprising or interesting things for you as someone who's transitioning from a non-technical to technical background? Also, Bloom's taxonomy is super cool. Where and how did you first discover it?
Okay, cool. Thanks, Mandy. I'll answer the second question first. Just like through Google researches, like going on Google being like, how can I learn master-based learning a bit more effectively? How does learning happen? What happens in the brain? Stuff like that. last night while I was preparing and practicing for this presentation, I actually landed on more learning frameworks and models that I have to look at now, but I think it was just like luck mainly. And also the name is pretty, Bloom's Taxonomy, you know, so I was like drawn to it, but it was just luck, I would say. And then, can you remind me what the first question was, Liz?
Yes. What were some of the most surprising or interesting things for you as someone who's transitioning from a non-technical background to technical?
Okay, so surprising perhaps was the joy I get from struggling effectively. Like every day, like Monday to Friday, I'll study for some consistent hours. And even if I don't understand a thing, I actually enjoy the process of going from like beginner to fluent. So it was really surprising because in my previous lives, it was more human-centered work where a lot of it was like nonverbal communication, understanding like how government agencies work, organizing, bit like more larger context. Whereas this is like surprisingly peaceful, even though it's very like debugging one thing after the other, not understanding things day in and day out. But I found it super, super fun. And that's something I'm grateful for.
Awesome. So let's go to the next question from Yulu. Again, he's wondering, how has having checkpoint where you assess your progress, a feedback loop, affected your metacognitive processes? How you choose to proceed with the learning?
Good question. So Mandy's actually doing a presentation tomorrow on metacognition, and Mandy had actually posted an article on Slack months ago, which really affected how I started approaching flashcards. But basically, metacognition is just being aware of what's happening, how are you learning, what's the context you're in. So not just being like completely immersed in what you're doing, but also the context around it, including yourself. So metacognition has been helpful with Bloom's taxonomy and just being like, for example, let's say, do I recognize what a string is? Yes, no. Does it feel like I have a gap? If so, I'll mark it and then I'll come back to it later. Let's say I'm not able to recall the distinction between encapsulation and abstraction. Being aware of how I feel or how I'm progressing through something gives me clues on where I can put more energy towards. So the taxonomy is good for like checkpoints, but also questions you can ask yourself and then things you can do around it to just test yourself more often. So that way just no like illusion that you're fluent. You're really just like self-assessing through different angles continuously. And metacognition comes in and really like allows you to be aware of yourself as a learner through this process.
Awesome. And then we have two more questions from Brenton. Have you used the Feynman technique and does it fit somewhere in Bloom's taxonomy?
Yes, well, actually, the spot is really great for this because if you're able to explain something to someone that's not 5-year-old, but that's actually going through the same process as you or has, even if you've aced it and you come back, the Feynman technique helps to explain something to a human being that actually wants to learn as well. So that's a technique that I would include with precision. And yes, so a lot with the spot, talking to other human beings, because it's easy when I'm alone to say like, oh yeah, I get it, but communicating it to someone else in verbal or written form takes more effort because the delivery matters. And the assessments, you're essentially like writing your understanding to another human being, and you have to be able to explain it with precision and not get all over the place. So Feynman technique helps definitely.
Awesome. And the final question from Yvonne, how do you determine whether you're, sorry, it just scrolled away, whether you're overlearning unnecessary minutiae instead of useful and practical information that will actually help you make progress?
That's a good question. And that's something I struggled with a lot at first because there's so many ways to implement something within programming, right? You have a question, you could solve it 100 different ways if you wanted to, and it would all be valid in a slightly different context. So what you see on the screen is how I make sure that I'm not going into rabbit holes, but focus more on understanding the fundamentals. So separating perhaps concepts from language implementation. This is a big one for me, because if I'm able to understand what a concept does and its role within the larger image of software engineering or programming, I can then look up the implementation details. But if I don't have a solid mental model on what's happening, or how a concept works, or its purpose, problems it solves, or why it's even built that way, it's easy to be like, okay, well, I just need to know how to loop with each, with select, with map, instead of understanding why they exist and then what problems they fundamentally solve. Because at launch school, again, you're learning software engineering through language. You have to be able to distinguish both of those. There are things that you'll be able to pick up later on if you really understand problems that programming concepts solve, and then just look up the implementation. But always trust yourself that if you are able to understand a problem, you'll be 10 times more equipped to solve it through implementation. But this also brings up another point that I learned recently, was you can be precise or you can be accurate. But if you're precise without being accurate, you're being precise in terms of answering something that has nothing to do with the original problem. Whereas if you're accurate, you can precisely answer the problem that you're given, if that makes sense.
Awesome. So that wraps it up for our questions. Kim, I sent you a Slack message and I'll send you a link for your question. Let's hand it over to Kyle to wrap things up. And thank you again, Leena.
Yeah, so with that, we're going to wrap this seminar up. Thanks again, Leena, for a fascinating look at your individualized mastery and your journey through Bloom's taxonomy. A note, our presenters and organizers have worked very hard this week to put this week of seminars together. So to all involved, thank you for continuing your work to build our community and to spread the joy of learning. To all of our wonderful studious participants, thank you for attending today and supporting the pursuit of higher level learning. And one final plug here, remember there are many more seminars to come this week from other Launch School students and graduates. So if you haven't already, stop by the social network on Slack whenever Slack is working again. Check out this week's schedule and drop us a line to let us know what you've learned from these seminars. So thank you for coming and have a great rest of your day.